My colleague Peter Ndoro spoke to senior Ethiopia analyst with the International Crisis Group, William Davison, on the Tigray conflict and the risks that it poses for Ethiopia.
It's a bit more than significant movements. We actually have an act now in Tigray region. That's after the federal government launched a military intervention on the early hours of Wednesday. And that's really to remove the leadership of Tigray region, known as the TPLF, the ruling party there. This is the culmination of years of political tensions emanating from a power struggle that led to the change of power in 2018 and the TPLF's loss of federal power in 2018 and 19. And then this year we saw a very serious constitutional dispute after the federal government extended all government's terms, including Tigray's, because of the COVID-19 pandemic delaying elections. Tigray's government said this was unacceptable, unconstitutional. They went ahead and ran their own regional election in defiance of federal authority. And that ended up with the federal government classifying Tigray's government as unconstitutional, and Tigray's government saying that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's administration had overstayed its constitutional mandate. And that's really what sowed the seeds for this conflict.
So it wasn't unexpected then that something that's a storm that's been brewing for years that would escalate to this point, and something had to give.
Yes, that's broadly right. Obviously, you never know exactly when these things are going to tip into this sort of extreme situation. And we should be clear here that this looks like it could be a potentially disastrous conflict if it continues and escalates, which looks like it is set to. But on top of that constitutional electoral dispute I described, or sort of as a result of that, the federal government has decided to run polls in as late as June next year, and that raised the huge question mark over whether Tigray would allow the federal government to run polls, considering that TPLF, Tigray's government, has described the federal government as having no legal authority. So really, something had to give there.
So where does this leave the federal government and Tigray then? There's a full-on conflict, and it appears from all reports that both armies are quite well equipped and able to fight for some time.
Well, of course, I guess technically we only have one military here. We only have one army. We have the federal military. But the key points here are that, the Tigray region has a relatively well-armed and large security apparatus, which it's been building up over the last couple of years. That has a sort of paramilitary characteristic to it. It also has a fairly large militia at the local level, quite well drilled, full of experienced veterans. And then a massive factor here is that the most powerful unit of the federal military, the Northern Command, which has been facing up to Eritrea and largely fought the war against Eritrea, there are huge question marks over whether that Northern Command, which contains a significant proportion of Tigrayan officers, about its loyalty or its commitment to join in this federal military intervention to remove Tigray's government. These are the factors that make it look like, despite this being a conflict between the federal government and one of the regions of the federation, that actually it looks like this could be a very protracted conflict. And we should also add there seems to be considerable support from the Tigrayan population for the sort of kind of key elements of the regional government position as well.
So what is likely to happen next then? I mean, the whole federal idea, I suppose, sounded good to have all of these different states under one umbrella, but there was always these tensions about sovereignty, if I can use that word. Might this start some kind of contagion in other regions, people also looking perhaps to say, hang on, we want more power, we actually want to separate from the Ethiopia project?
Well, not immediately. I think this is, you're right to point to those strains within the Ethiopian Federation. It is something of an unsettled It's an unsettled state, meaning that there is considerable opposition to fundamental elements of the federal system itself. And as you noted, there is this tension between those who believe there should be more central authority in Addis Ababa and those who believe in regional autonomy and everything that comes with that. I think perhaps the way to look at this in this context is that because this promises possibly, obviously we hope not, obviously we hope the parties will pull back, but because there is the prospect that this could be a very serious conflict, that really would test the Ethiopian armed forces, as we've noted, generally test the Ethiopian state. And this is on top of, some pre-existing very serious political turbulence. So it certainly has the potential to destabilize and to bring up all of these questions that you mentioned. And, ultimately, I think what needs to happen here is not only do we need the parties to pull back from the brink of this ongoing conflict, but that also needs to merge into a much broader political conversation where Ethiopia's political settlement would be hopefully successfully renegotiated.
All right. If we look at Tigray and Addis Ababa now, is there a middle ground? The Prime Minister has to be seen to be in charge of the whole country, but at the same time, it's clear that he probably has to give something. Is there something that he could give without appearing to be giving up some of his strength?
Well, quite frankly, not really at the moment. And the fact of the matter is, these were former allies in a ruling coalition. We've had that political fallout. We've had the constitutional dispute. They failed to come to terms, and now they're in conflict. So the only way out of this conflict situation is some form of backtracking, some form of concessions. And safe to say, that is not going to happen if we expect it to come only from the Prime Minister and Addis Ababa. Clearly, there needs to be some form of mutual concessions here. As noted, the two parties, the regional and the federal government, they've both described each other as unlawful and unconstitutional. I think the first step, perhaps, is for a major political gesture in the interest of peace to be made, to agree that the other parties are legitimate authorities to the extent that they can be a negotiating partner. That will hopefully allow a ceasefire to form to address the constitutional dispute. And then once that occurs, there are all of these other broader issues, much of them related to Ethiopia's federal settlement, which can then be brought into discussions.
So now we're dealing with a Prime Minister who not so long ago got a Nobel Peace Prize for bringing calm to parts of the region. How much of this turbulence could spread beyond Ethiopia's borders?
Well, the immediate risk here is that Eritrea is brought into the conflict, long border with Tigray, despite the peace deal with Addis Ababa, very hostile relations still between the Tigray leadership and Eritrea. So could Tigray forces or forces loyal to Tigray provoke the Eritrean military into action? That seems possible. It also seems possible that if this does become bogged down and there is no sort of clear federal superiority, would President Isaias assist the Ethiopian federal government in trying to remove the TPLF, his arch enemies? That seems possible. If we look to the west, the main, or really the only supply route for Tigray, given its hostile relations with Eritrea and now the rest of Ethiopia, or at least the Ethiopian federal government, the main supply route is through eastern Sudan. We've had sort of attempts at border closures there, so that obviously there's a possibility of destabilization in eastern Sudan. Ethiopia is a major peacekeeping contributor to Somalia and a major player there. We've seen proxy conflicts play out in Somalia before. There's the obvious risk there. And then there's Djibouti, obviously a very vulnerable state because of its size, but then with its outsized importance in terms of its port. So another potential, also potential for destabilization there.
I would imagine that speed of resolution is probably important because the longer it goes on, the harder it might be to resolve some of these issues.
I mean, I guess that's true. The logic of conflict, I guess, is that it becomes harder to take the necessary backtracking steps. I do think there is a flip side to that, though. As mentioned, essentially, both sides are looking for a military solution right now, as we understand it. That's certainly their stated public intentions. And although there is not sort of widespread, sustained conflict so far, we are in a live conflict situation. The point I'm making is that, perhaps if this conflict begins to look entrenched to the extent that the parties have to acknowledge it, will that get them to rethink the path that they are on so that they do not lead to the type of disastrous outcomes we are talking about? Equally, if the idea of a quick, clean military conflict by the military success by the federal government does not come to pass, that will also give Ethiopia's regional, continental, and international partners the opportunity to say, where is this heading? This hasn't been quick and easy. Really, you need to rethink here. So, yes, there is a worrying momentum that can gather, but perhaps also, if the conflict looks like it's becoming entrenched, it could lead to a rethink, hopefully.
All right, you mentioned those regional bodies, and that was going to be my next question, actually. Is it too soon for them to step in? Does more still need to happen before it becomes a concern for maybe the African Union, maybe?
Oh, this is absolutely a concern for the African Union. We saw a rare statement on Ethiopia the other day. They didn't go at the issue directly, but that's, a very rare intervention from the AU. Prime Minister Hamdok of Sudan has been reaching out to his counterpart in Ethiopia and also to leaders in Mekelle, I believe. President Ramaphosa, the current AU chair, has also expressed concern and interest in the situation. Anybody aware of this situation has to be concerned about it. That isn't the problem. The problem is getting the Ethiopian parties off the conflict path and into some form of efforts of finding a negotiated solution to that. These efforts are ongoing. The outstanding question is, will they be successful?
All right. And perhaps as a final question, as somebody who's been watching this region and this country for some time, do you think that there is a path to solving this? And even if it does get solved, what does it mean in the long term? Because once you've tested each other and tested each other's strengths, you never get quite back to where you were before.
Well, I think I give a sort of similar answer to before. Ethiopia is staring into the abyss here. All sorts of power struggles, political games have been played out over the last few years. The warning signs have been there. Nothing has emerged in terms of a new sustainable political settlement. They've been driving each other into this type of direction. Now that we are at the 11th hour, will that convince people to fundamentally rethink their approach? Yes, there are genuine political divisions, ideological divisions, historical enmities, and all the rest of it. Nobody is denying that. But it's a question of how you go about solving those disputes. And it looks fairly obvious from where I am sitting and where many observers are sitting that this effort to resolve the disputes is not going to benefit anyone. And quite the opposite, it could lead to harm and death for thousands and millions of people.